Well, here we are, part 3 of the video series on the CED, the continuation of a story of why and how that will make you think why and how. Now, a quick recap of what we've learned so far. In the mid-1960s, RCA had come up with an idea for a video player using discs not too unlike those of conventional record players. It took a frustratingly long time to come to fruition, and by the time it was released in 1981, it was competing with not only the video cassette recorders coming in from Japan, but also with the laser optical disc system backed by Philips MCA. Featuring a perfect mix of the worst parts of tape and the worst parts of Laserdisc, the format swiftly failed, and by 1984, RCA gave up, and then basically died altogether. Since it's already been covered in the last 2 videos, I'm not going to get into how this works. Go watch those if you're interested. This video is here to answer the question, why on earth was this project so gosh darn slow? And the answer to that question is remarkably complex. We need to go back to the history of RCA so that we can get a little more context. And, just to warn you, a retelling of this story pretty much has to be non-linear in time, so strap in and pay attention! David Sarnoff was a legendary figure in the world of RCA, and indeed in consumer electronics as a whole. His work at RCA predated RCA itself. He was only 9 years old when his family arrived in the US from Russia in 1900, and just 7 years later he had joined the ranks of American Marconi. Even during his very early years, it was obvious that he had a knack for innovation. He was constantly sending memos within the company suggesting improvements to their equipment and methods. And he's even said to essentially be the father of commercial radio, using the term radio music box to describe a potential household application for the infant communications technology. When American Marconi became RCA in 1919, Sarnoff was commercial manager, and by 1930 he had become general manager. While both the president and chairman were positions above his role, their holders, Edmund Nally and Owen Young, respectively, were largely preoccupied with external affairs. Thus, Sarnoff effectively had complete control over the company by this time. Sarnoff had learned that in the business of radio, one could not simply exist by doing the same things again and again. Innovation was absolutely key. In a 1928 speech to the Harvard Business School, he said, "No industrial organization devoted to radio could hope to survive unless it traveled with the art." He believed that to achieve success, the company should have a culture of inventiveness. Not only would this ensure a leading position in the market, but future development could and would prove to be beneficial to the company, often in unseen ways. And in fact, it wasn't the consumer electronics industry that really defined RCA initially. In its early years, RCA's key assets were its patents. The birth of RCA happened to seize control of American Marconi's position. As remember, they were British, and we can't have them controlling things. Initially, its mission was to simply gain control of the wireless communications industry, establish and grow a pool of patents, and serve as a merchandising arm for its parent companies who might want to sell radio equipment on the open market. At this time, RCA was owned by General Electric, Westinghouse, AT&T, and, weirdly, United Fruit. Various American Marconi stockholders retained some ownership interest as well. Anyway, through the transition from American Marconi to RCA, David Sarnoff continued fighting for his radio music box idea. And nobody was having it. He didn't yet have much power in the company to influence that sort of thing, but he didn't care. He just kept at it, telling everyone he could, "We need to make radios, you guys." And finally, after a couple of radio stations had been licensed to start broadcasting, his superiors gave in. In 1920, $2,000 was allocated for the development of a new radio receiver and various accessories. Also, somehow, Sarnoff got his superiors on board with starting their own experimental broadcasts, and the radio station WJZ was formed as a joint venture between RCA and Westinghouse. You have no idea how right Sarnoff was about this whole household radio business. Well, okay, you probably do, but he was very right. Almost immediately, demand for radio receivers exploded. Sales figures went from essentially nothing in 1920 to $60 million in 1922, $130 million by 1923, and $358 million in 1924. I do believe it's safe to say that radio was the iPhone of the 1920s. And RCA was not exactly in a place to meet this demand. Nobody had yet figured that this business, which wasn't created to sell radios, would need to sell radios. But they needed to sell radios, and they needed to figure this out fast. Surprisingly, they managed to do it. In just the span of 1 year, 1921 to 22, their sales team went from 14 people, that's 14 people, to 200 offices across the country, each with their own sets of people. By 1922, the business of entertainment radio was RCA's largest. So much for doubting Sarnoff, eh? In fact, it was thanks to this explosive growth that Sarnoff was promoted to vice president and general manager. And Sarnoff learned something interesting through all this. Even though they were selling plenty of radios, they didn't actually need to manufacture anything at all to make money, so long as they held some nice and juicy patents. RCA owned thousands of radio patents, and for years, if any company, anybody at all, wanted to build a radio to sell to the public, they'd have to pay royalties to RCA. Now, this wasn't exactly working in the Wild West days of radio. The courts hadn't yet enforced RCA's patents, and so RCA couldn't reasonably pursue any patent litigation. They could only threaten. And the early days of radio were very tumultuous. The rapid pace of innovation meant that most newcomers ultimately failed. 600 of roughly 900 companies building radio receivers during this early boom had shut down by 1927. But eventually RCA's patents were deemed valid, and milk them they did. RCA essentially owned the radio business starting in the mid-20s. They created a system known as package licensing, which effectively forced anyone in the radio business to pay some pretty hefty loyalties to them. In fact, these new licensees had to pay past damages to RCA. Suddenly, RCA had nearly complete control of the radio industry. Now, this may have been all cool and groovy to RCA, and in fact, David Sarnoff tried to defend these licensing tactics as RCA's birthright, but this very anti-competitive behavior eventually landed them in trouble with, well, everybody. In the meantime, though, oh wow, were things going well for RCA! Their patents and royalties raked in millions of dollars, and it meant that the radio industry could grow tremendously on the backs of hundreds of other companies, all the while RCA getting a nice and healthy cut. The success of these tactics cemented in Sarnoff's mind the importance of research to the company's long-term success. So long as they could keep inventing things and get their patent on it, they'd be golden forever. And it wasn't just that they were getting rich that made Sarnoff so eager to pursue research. It was also the knowledge that once everybody had bought a radio, there wouldn't be much potential for growth anymore. By 1929, RCA alone was selling 75,000 radio sets per week, pulling in $30 million in profit annually. With so many radios already sold, it was inevitable that these sales numbers wouldn't last. Even more of a reason to keep cranking out those patents. This realization also ushered in an era of diversification for RCA. After working out a deal to buy AT&T's various radio stations, RCA had formed the National Broadcasting Company. That's right, NBC. Of course, RCA purchased Victor Talking Machine in 1929, and it was around this time that Sarnoff sought to free RCA from its owners. Buying Victor was part of that strategy, as it would suddenly give them loads of manufacturing capabilities to make it on their own. And in a sort of lucky break, I guess, the whole RCA is owned by GE and is getting kinda monopolistic thing came to a head in 1930. Seeing that that probably wasn't going to end well, Sarnoff convinced RCA's owners to let it become its own self-contained operation. Striving to make their own tubes and radio receivers, RCA acquired more manufacturing space from Westinghouse in Indianapolis and from GE in New Jersey. And to make it all once and for all final, in 1931 a consent decree formally split RCA from GE and Westinghouse. For the record, I'm glossing over a lot of particulars because we're into the 9th minute already. Alright, now with RCA essentially operating on its own terms, and with all of the various new facilities that Sarnoff had managed to acquire before they were formally broken off, they were set to become the forerunners of the electronic age. And perhaps the most important way they did that was through creating the Rca Laboratories. It took some time for RCA to realize that research needed to be centralized. In the early 1930s, research departments existed in many of their facilities across the country, and each of them was left to their own devices. But in the rush to the next big thing, television, well, and also World War II, Sarnoff realized, after much pleading from his subordinates, that there would need to be a real effort made to put the company's bright minds all in one place. RCA engineers had been wanting their own facilities like the famous Bell Laboratories or General Electric's laboratories for years, and with the increasing number of government research contracts coming in because, the world was falling apart, as well as the future promises of the television industry, they got what they wanted. In March 1941, research officially became a separate entity in RCA, and RCA Laboratories was to receive its own brand new facility in Princeton, New Jersey later that year. Now, the existence of the laboratories is important on many fronts, but we're going to focus on two essential things that happened thanks to the creation of the laboratories. First was a shift to fundamental research, and second was a creation of a new corporate politics that would eventually tear the company apart. First, an explanation on the move to fundamental research. RCA's various research efforts during the war, as well as the simple fact that they had freed up manufacturing space in their facilities across the country now that research was all taking place in Princeton, primed them for domination in television. Production of cathode ray tubes for radar displays could easily be adapted to create television picture tubes once the war was over. And of course, immeasurable amounts of new electronics knowledge was learned during the war effort. Their patents on television technologies allowed them to enjoy a sequel to the success that they had achieved in the early days of radio. And let's not forget, they owned NBC, originally in two flavors, red and blue, but more legal action made them sell off the blue part, and that would become ABC. Still, RCA would make money from selling you a television, from the advertisers on their own television network, and even if you had the audacity to buy some other company's television set, well, RCA still got a bit of your money. Ever eager to move the state-of-the-art forward, RCA Laboratories started down the path to a more colorful, but less fruitful, future. In 1951, the year of his 45th anniversary, Sarnoff challenged his research staff to create 3 new inventions for him. First was a so-called light amplifier, dubbed Magna Lux. This seemed like a very strange concept, so he did some digging, and apparently this was an early flat-screen television technology. Go figure. The second, an all-electronic air conditioner, was an air conditioner that was entirely electronic. And the third, the videograph, was a device which could record television signals onto magnetic tape. Sarnoff asked for these gifts, as he called them, at the same time RCA was waging their bitter war with arch-nemesis CBS over creating the color television standard. Although RCA did eventually win that fight after a lot of litigation, color television wasn't going too well for them. Sales were slow, and the industry in general just didn't seem ready for color TV. They spent a lot of research money and time with not a lot to show for it. Not only had Sarnoff apparently jumped the gun with color TV, but his 3 gifts were either flops or embarrassments. His electronic air conditioner idea never went beyond producing what was called the world's most expensive ice cube, and his light amplifier was too expensive to feasibly produce. Side note, although the light amplifier never went anywhere, the first working liquid crystal displays were invented by George H. Heilmeyer in 1964 while he worked at RCA Labs. Neat. And although Sarnoff's videograph idea seemed promising, his insistence that it accommodate color signals kept the researchers from making any real progress. Seemingly, when RCA wasn't looking, a wild competition appeared. Skipping ahead in time a bit, a little company called Ampex had managed to perfect the quadruplex video recorder before RCA could get any real results from their videograph. What's more, it was objectively better than what RCA had managed to come up with in the meantime. This was not only embarrassing to RCA, but it also left a bad taste in their mouth. RCA did eventually work with Ampex to help them with the color side of things, as after all that was RCA's specialty, but their inability to achieve a pioneering position in videotape made many within RCA see videotape as a dead-end technology. Foreshadowing! Their color TV disappointment, as well as their videotape embarrassment, helped push RCA further into the fundamental research strategy they began in the late 1940s and would pursue heavily into the rest of the 1950s and into the 1960s. They had learned not only through the Ampex ordeal, but also through the fact that suddenly they had large competitors like Philco and Zenith, each with their own research departments, that the world was different now. To achieve great success, no longer could RCA simply be a place for applied sciences. They'd need to do their own sciencing themselves. Before too long, the RCA Laboratories became known less as a division of RCA and more as a proper research institution. RCA was happy to hire the world's most inquisitive minds from practically any discipline. Elmer Engstrom, the director of research and engineering, had come to believe that so long as fine research was coming out of the labs, they could capitalize on their efforts through licensing of new patents and production of various new consumer products as they saw fit. New hires into the RCA labs tended to hold advanced degrees, and they were encouraged to keep pursuing their previous work. Were you studying metallurgy at Harvard? Well, come work for us in the labs. You can keep your studies going while we pay you a salary. And for a while, this seemed to work. The Rca Laboratories became a world-renowned place of research, in part thanks to the continued funding by the government for more broad-reaching research efforts. And the new scientists at RCA were very happy to be able to continue publishing their research. You might gather that the labs became a source of envy for other parts of RCA. Now we're getting into the corporate politics part. Indeed, to many inside the company, it was viewed as a sort of country club, where resources were wasted on frivolous ideas. As the young scientists rose in the ranks and started to influence the direction of the operation towards more theoretical work, these feelings only intensified. Even within the labs, factions formed, as the industry veterans saw little corporate value in this new research, and the young scientist wished that Grandpa would shut up about marketability. These feelings had surfaced long before color television proved itself a disappointment, and in fact those feelings were turned up to 11 when in 1954, the very same year RCA first introduced color television, a corporate restructuring occurred. You know how well those always go, right? In fairness, this happened because the electronics industry was getting mighty complex, what with these new transistors coming into fashion and these computer things. Product research and development would be moved out of the laboratories and into so-called advanced development departments within each of RCA's divisions. Laboratories would continue with their froofy fundamental follies, but now the labs were broken into departments dedicated to disciplines such as chemical research, electronics research, acoustics research, etc. Now you might think, this is fine, so what if lab sticks to the fundamentals and the divisions actually do the product development? It's not like we need to make marketable inventions that we can patent and make licensing To make matters even worse than they already were, by this time RCA's various divisions were spread out all over the country, meaning that the labs were essentially operating independently from the rest of the company and almost unsupervised. Everybody there just happened to have a habit of aligning the company's needs with their own personal endeavors. And now that the divisions themselves were tasked with making the theory from the labs become the product to be marketed, researchers didn't want to follow through with that last step, as that would mean transferring to that division and losing your place in the lovable laboratories. You will be totally surprised, I'm sure, when I tell you that this eventually became a problem. See, the labs had been funded thanks to A, all that sweet patent money RCA was still raking in from television and radio, and B, all those government programs they were being paid to do research for. Well, in 1958, antitrust legislation yanked away a lot of that patent money, and government money was beginning to dry up. Now, the labs was in a position where it would need to prove itself. Okay, now I'm sure many of you out there have been wanting to ask, excuse me, but we are talking about the CED, aren't we? That's the story we're trying to tell, isn't it? And let me reassure you, this is indeed the story we're trying to tell. You see, there's just an awful lot of context here that becomes relevant in the future. Now, I'll try and condense the next half a decade into a few minutes. Just don't forget to add a can full of water before heating it. A few management rearrangements meant that this new labs needs to prove itself thing was delayed for a little while, and as luck would have it, RCA's color television work was finally beginning to pay off. In the early 1960s, suddenly everyone was like, we need a color TV. And RCA profited again through licensing patents, the antitrust stuff didn't affect their color work much, as well as through selling color television sets at the Consumer Products Division. They also caught a bit of a lucky break, as although the antitrust action made their US-based patent licensing for their older tech go away, they had a lot of success licensing their older patents to companies in Japan and Germany. However, Labs was once again forced to make itself less of a burden and, invent stuff again. Another management shakeup occurred, with James Hillier becoming the new head of laboratories, and Hillier recognized the need for Labs to take a leadership role, and that, as he put it, the rest of the corporation would have to see the laboratory as a life raft, not an albatross. But guess what? The rest of the corporation still resented the Labs a little bit. And the long-standing process of labs discovers something, they present it to the products divisions, and from then on the products divisions are supposed to figure out what to do with it, just never really worked. George Brown, corporate VP of Research and Engineering, had learned in the color TV development days that the various product divisions weren't likely to adopt a new product unless they thought they could take credit for the idea. So if the idea came from labs, they really just didn't care. And some divisions outright feared what was going on in the laboratories. For instance, at one point in time, the tube division, that's the folks making vacuum tubes or valves, had put up signs in their facilities that read, "Stamp out transistors." They saw developments at the labs as a threat to their existence. And you can't really blame them. In 1964, Hillier sought to once and for all make the laboratories work how the corporation needed it to. He created the Interim Research Planning Committee, or IRPCO, to guide the direction of the labs. He wanted to change it from its longtime university atmosphere to a proper corporate entity. As you may imagine, this caused problems. The same factions of entrepreneurial veterans and young scientists rekindled their dislike for each other, as the vets saw IRPCO as a much-needed direction definer, and the youngins resented being told what research to perform. IRPCO itself didn't last terribly long, thanks to, among other things, Hillier being promoted out of the labs, but the mission of think about things from inception to market was kept alive by the new head laboratorian, William Webster. And, fun fact, perhaps the only thing that the laboratories actually carried through to the commercialization stage was a research project called HomeFax. This was an idea to use one of the television signal's lines in the unseen vertical blanking interval to encode slow-scan television and transmit information in text or image form alongside the television signal. In 1967, RCA announced this system, but the industry didn't really seem to care about it, so it was abandoned. If this sounds an awful lot like a precursor to teletext, that's because it is. Teletext is... Alright, we're past the 20-minute mark. To those of you who have stuck around, congratulations, and thank you. Here's where the CED comes in. No, we're gonna at least start. Remember how I had said in earlier videos that the CED started research in 1964? Well, that's actually not quite true. In fact, back in 1959, William Webster headed the Electronics Research Laboratory, and he had formed a team with the Systems Research Laboratory, led by Thomas Stanley, to work out the limits of what could be done with integrated circuits. But one of Stanley's side projects was figuring out the potential of storing and retrieving information on a vinyl disc. This work led them to the capacitance concept and laid the first foundations for the CED. What did happen in 1964 was that RCA had committed to finding a sequel to color television. Just as had happened with radio and then black and white television, the corporation knew that eventually color TV sales are gonna dry up. In a spring 1964 meeting, the laboratory directors decided that they needed to commit to theoretical and experimental work to develop a, quote, practical and low-cost video recorder that would lead to mass market. They didn't know exactly how they were going to do it, and they had many potential paths to pursue, but gosh darn it, they knew they wanted something ready. And soon. So what went wrong? If the capacitance effect was discovered in 1959, and they had committed to a video player in 1964, how could it possibly have taken until 1981 to bring this product to market? Well, lots of things went wrong, from corporate politics to an appearance from their arch nemesis to outright mismanagement. Nearly everything you can think of to delay this project was about to occur. And we'll talk about that in part 4. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video to be as interesting as I find this story to be fascinating. Today, I have a very special thanks to make at the end of this video. Much of the information in this video came from this incredible book by Margaret B.W. Graham. When you look around online for information on the CED, it leads you to believe that much of it is lost to history, but no, There's so much to know in just this one book, and it's filled with incredible context, gets into all the nuance, and paints a delightfully detailed picture. I'll of course be finishing this story here on this channel, but if anyone wants to know even more about the CED, much more than I could ever fit into a video, or 4, track down a copy of this book. Much of it is accessible on Google Books, but not all of it, and truthfully I don't even know if it's still in print. But hopefully, if enough people buy some copies, Cambridge University Press will make another run. And as always, thank you to everyone supporting this channel through Patreon, especially the fine folks scrolling up your screen. It would not be possible to make videos like this without knowing I had your support. If you'd like to join these awesome folks, check out the link in the description or stick around until the end screen. Thanks for your consideration, and I'll see you next time. Long-time university atmosphere to a proper corporate entity. Proper. Long-time university atmosphere to a proper... I just said proper again. As you may imagine, this caused problems. The same factions of entrepreneur... Part 3 of the videos... No, I don't like how that started. I like it. Only the video cassette recorders coming in from Japan, but... Nope. Since it's already been... Why did you stop? For an explanation on the... Well, I didn't want to... I was mad at... They had signs hanging up that said, read...